Here we go.
So you often make the argument that the US pursues strategic sequencing, that is more or less a staged approach to how it confronts rival powers. So essentially seeking to take on one at a time. And for this reason, when the US engages in negotiation or peace, you make the point that it's essentially delaying tactics, just setting it up for a later time, or at times it can also include a different division of labor, that is to outsource some of the war to allies. And well, I thought about you when I was reading this recent speech by Elbridge Colby, the US Undersecretary of War for Policy, in which he makes it, well, I would say unmistakably clear that the US is not seeking to put an end to the Ukraine war. Rather, it's outsourcing it to the Europeans.
Thing is, what they did to Alex Jones, it was doubly effective because it tricked people like Asmongold, our favorite normie. He hears about the $1 billion judgment against Alex Jones. He figured, oh, Alex Jones must have lied about the Sandy Hook shooting. If he realized that Alex Jones never had a chance to defend himself, and the judge just said, summary judgment, you're guilty, pay $1 billion. Asmongold is naive enough to think the truth is a defense against defamation. Not in Alex Jones' case.
Who should continue to fight and escalate. I was wondering, how did you make sense of this speech?
It's just an update of the division of labor that U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth announced at the very beginning of 2025, almost as soon as the Trump administration came into office. He talked about how the U.S. needed to pivot elsewhere, now we know, to Iran and ultimately onward.
I'll have a look at Asmongold's latest video after this.
Towards China. And he said Europe is going to take over and basically feed itself next into this proxy war taking place against Russia in Ukraine. That is exactly what Europe did. He told Europe they are going to spend more on defense, and they have. And he told them they're going to double down on their support for Ukraine, and they have done that as well.
Yep.
And we're watching the natural progression of all of this take shape into Europe itself throwing itself into this proxy war against Russia itself. It's extremely dangerous.
If you watched my other video a few days ago about this, yes, the provocations are reaching new levels. They're making drones to shoot deep into Russia, then launching those drones from Baltic states, from Baltic airspace into Russia to damage critical infrastructure. You can't get more provocative than that.
Very concerning. The rhetoric coming out of Russia, knowing and seeing this taking shape themselves, is very, very concerning. And unfortunately, that's what this was always going to end up being anyway. And I distinctively remember warning people that didn't matter who you voted for in 2024, this is exactly what was going to happen. The whole reason the U.S. was fighting this war against Russia and Ukraine in the first place, and it is a U.S. war on Russia, simply being fought through Ukraine. Again, go back to the 2019 Rand Corporation paper extending Russia.
Yeah, I was worried about how things would turn out because for anyone who's involved with the dollar Ponzi scheme, one out to get out of the Ponzi scheme would be some type of global war because, it's not because we've been fucking around behind the scenes for 80 years and completely gutted our financial system and our currency. It's because, suddenly there was this world war and yeah. But so far, I don't think they'll manage to pull that off because they haven't, everything is going wrong for them. The Ukraine war is going wrong. The Iran war is going wrong. The vaccine IDs didn't work. Vaccine passports didn't work. There's stuff they want, but they can't pull it off. Then again, they did do COVID.
The whole purpose of this is to create one of many dilemmas for Russia. They're doing a similar strategy toward Iran and ultimately China. Create all of these dilemmas and extend Russia as much as possible. It was never their intention to overwhelm and defeat Russia with just this war against Russia in Ukraine. It was just one of many policy options that were in that policy paper that have since been implemented. And one of the things they were talking about was destroying Russia's energy exports to Europe, and how the U.S. was going to ramp up LNG exports to Europe. At the time, it made no sense because Europe still had access to plentiful, reliable, cheap Russian energy. And they said, even in the paper, they said, in peacetime, this has a very low likelihood of succeeding, except it has succeeded. And do you know how they managed to make it succeed? They took peacetime and they simply turned it into wartime. And the only way this policy...
very effective, yes. Way to sell U.S. LNG is create war and take Russian LNG off the market.
Of keeping Europe dependent on American energy and off of Russian energy and extending and undermining Russia is by keeping the war going. So there was never any intention at all, ever, of the U.S. wanting to make peace with Russia. And this is the...
Trump probably, yes, wanted to, but the deep state, the U.S. actors, no, they didn't want peace.
Exact same reason why the U.S. has absolutely no interest in making peace with Iran, because ultimately all of this...
I say that Trump probably wanted peace because look at how much time he wasted on it. Look at the meeting in Alaska. Look at his repeated negotiations and Biden didn't bother with all that, but there was no negotiations whatever under Biden. That was when the deep state was in control and they didn't want peace. Trump, I mean, if he wanted the war to continue, why did he waste all that time and energy on negotiations that were good? I think it's much more likely that he honestly wanted to negotiate some type of peace, but he was sabotaged by, on the one side, reality that two positions were too far apart, what Zelensky and Putin, what their demands were, and by probably the deep state too, sabotaging it, like with the Putin assassination attempt
against Russia and Iran is meant to target not just China, but also Asia. And I would argue that the war on Iran and disrupting all energy coming from the Middle East and disrupting not just China's supply of energy from the Middle East, but all of Asia's supply of energy from the Middle East. This is simply the US doing to Asia what it has already done to Europe. They cut Europe off from Russia, from energy through war, and now they're using war to cut Asia off from energy from the Middle East.
I guess what's very frustrating about this whole thing is that all the evidence is there, yet there seems to be this...
Thing is, U.S. already controls the Gulf producers. It controls Saudi Arabia. It controls Qatar, Dubai, and all those places. And having Asia dependent on places the U.S. control, that's already good enough in terms of geopolitical advantage. So, yes, maybe cutting off Europe from Russian LNG, yes, that was part of the plan. But I don't think the deep state wanted the Strait of Hormuz closed. It wrecks too many things. And it shuts down the petrodollar flows. All the money that normally the Gulf states invest in the dollar. The shutdown of that, I'm absolutely convinced the deep state did not want.
Very deliberate desire to just live in our own fake little world, the way it's being sold, essentially. As you can look towards the people who discuss the benefit of the Ukraine war, from Graham, McConnell, Kellogg, Romney. The list is long, where they make the point, oh, this is going to be a good war. We can fight with Ukrainians. We don't have to waste our own soldiers, and using Ukraine to knock out Russia, we can focus on the Chinese instead. It can be said in the open, but again, it's not a world which these people are comfortable living in with. So they essentially ignore it. And the same with what you said with decoupling Europe from Russia in terms of energy. This is a disaster for Europe, but they said this long in advance. All the strategic documents say Nord Stream is a bad thing. Then, of course, just as they said they would, they knock out Nord Stream, and then they can sell all the stories. Yeah, it's a Russian playbook.
Yeah, it was the CIA. They might have used Ukrainian actors to sabotage Nord Stream, cut off the flows of oil to Germany from Russia through that pipeline. But it was the United States okayed it and probably directed the operation.
Okay, obviously Russia destroys its own infrastructure. We repeat it, even when it's exposed.
The media tried to sell that idea that Russia destroyed its own critical oil infrastructure. I mean, the thing is, there's some lies that are too bold that even the corrupt mainstream media has trouble repeating them.
Then we say, okay, well, I guess Russia didn't do it anyways. We will embrace any ridiculous story as opposed to face reality. So it's it's quite weird that this is actually real. But it seems, it seems kind of obvious that the goal is to outsource the war to the Europeans, which will essentially make the Europeans into the new Ukrainians. And these escalations, they worry me though, because primarily, well, the main two things is the massive drone program, which is done very, very openly. And
again, that might be what the deep state wants, to outsource the war to Europeans. But what it originally wanted is for Russia to collapse under the Ukrainian war. That was the original goal. This is the new plan now that Ukrainians collapse instead of Russia. And like so many of it, deep state, the globalist plans in the last few years, it's going to fail, just like vaccine passports.
It's very hard for Russia not to respond to this and making matters much worse. We know now that attacks are coming out of NATO territory, that is out of European states, then the Finland and the Baltic states. All of this is happening while the US is pulling back and handing this.
And what I mean it will fail is that, yes, the corrupt leader, globalists, will try and perhaps have already succeeded in provoking Russia enough to widen the war, but the European people will revolt if they try to do something like a draft in like France, Germany, UK to fight Russia. European people are like, fuck that. Why do I have to go dying for the Baltic state? Lithuania? No. I'm not dying for Lithuania. Fuck that. It won't work.
War to the Europeans, which seem to be very eager to take over. I mean, do you think the Europeans are being set up for war?
Yes, absolutely. And
yes,
I would say the Americans are...
Like France recently started preparing hospitals that can handle thousands of wounded. And why would you be doing that if you weren't preparing for war?
Backing away in the sense of absolving themselves of responsibility, but they're very much still involved in the war. The U.S. command is still in Germany, overseeing the entire war. All of these
Yes.
drone strikes deep inside Russian territory, again, according to the New York Times itself, and as is obvious to all of us who know the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities required to do this effectively, it had to always have been the U.S. They admit it was the CIA and the U.S. military overseeing this drone program, striking deep inside Russian territory. Not only that, but also the maritime drone attacks taking place all around the globe, targeting tankers carrying Russian energy exports. So the U.S. is still very much deeply involved and overseeing this entirely, but they're absolving themselves of responsibility, and they're putting the European.
It's the deep state as it's collapsing, as the dollar hegemony is collapsing. It's leveraging all its pieces to delay the day of reckoning. And one of its pieces is all these corrupt globalist leaders in Europe that have been already just through this Ukraine war, cutting them off from cheap Russian energy, have devastated their economies. These people are betraying their countries for U.S. interests. But anyway, the deep state is leveraging them more and more intensely as the dollar collapse nears, and to delay that, and forcing their globalists, their puppets in Europe to do things that will turn the European people against them increasingly fast. And eventually the puppets won't be able to deliver. There'll be elections, they'll be voted out of power, and the United States and the deep state will lose control of Europe. And because Europe tries to fight a war with Russia, people will reject that. And it's all a big part of a dying U.S. empire. You're going to see more stuff like that. Like over the last 80 years, the United States, the deep state, has weasels its way in, got influence on so many different countries, so many different groups. And every one of them is going to be leveraged to the breaking point in an effort to keep the system going. And this trying to expand the Ukraine war into Europe is part of that dynamic.
Europeans out there in the front, and also, as you mentioned, getting the Europeans ready to be the next proxy into the breach as Ukraine slowly crumbles. I think you will watch a very gradual, incremental salami slice approach, having the Europeans just get a little bit more involved. There was a little bit of a scare where people thought maybe British warplanes were trying to intercept Russian drones over Ukraine, but they might just have floated that story out there just to test the waters.
They definitely floated the story. So maybe it was test the water, or maybe it actually happened. I don't know which one, but Romania definitely said that, claimed that UK jets shot down Russian drones over Ukraine. And just the fact that they reported that story is a huge provocation.
A little bit, and they might actually start doing things like that to incrementally get Europe more and more deeply involved. And they're already utterly involved in the war. The U.S. is fighting Russia through Europe just as much as they're fighting it through Ukraine in many ways.
Yes.
We know that European weapons are going into Ukraine. And as you mentioned, the drone production, we knew this wasn't really all taking place inside Ukraine. And all of these weapons, missiles, even tanks that they say Ukraine is making, they're not making any of those. It's all being built all across Europe, in the United States, in other U.S. proxy territories. And then it's simply being finally assembled in Ukraine. And that's how they just can say it was made in Ukraine. And so it's a whole process that's been taking shape for years, the whole course of this proxy war. And unfortunately, it does look like Europe is going to end up in almost indirect conflict with Russia. And people will say, why is Europe doing this? Because this doesn't serve their interests at all. But this is the danger and the power of American political capture over these countries. They control the information space. They control the political space.
The information space and the political space. Exactly. The media. The media is the biggest weapon of the deep state. It's in a world where you have democracies everywhere. If you control the media, you practically control the governments everywhere. That's why the United States pushes democracy so hard, is because you push country into democracy, then you lie to its people through the media you control. You can just get the people to vote for things that are completely against their interest, for politicians that are completely corrupt and will betray their people. That is how the world works. The functioning media is the foundation to a healthy world, to a world that where this nonsense doesn't happen. And the mainstream media needs to collapse, and that will happen when the dollar collapses, and we'll finally be free of all this nonsense.
U.S. corporations are working in tandem with some of the largest European interests, but American interests are actually dominant even in Europe in many cases. And so this is why this is happening. And this is the same reason why we watch the Persian Gulf Arab states go along with the U.S. war of aggression against Iran. This is why we're going to watch countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. They'll go along with U.S. escalation vis-a-vis China, even though their largest trade partner, import and export, is China. They'll go along with it because their governments are politically captured. And ultimately, those handful of individuals, this is how elite capture works. Those handful of individuals work for U.S. interests at the expense of their own country's interests.
Absolutely.
Their position is owed to the U.S. and they do everything on behalf of the United States.
Think of it this way. Think of people worry about the amount of influence Jewish celebrity has in the United States because of all these campaign contributions. Well, these politicians in Europe benefit from positive coverage from the global media controlled by basically the United States. And that is worth more than any money. And that's how they stay in power. And so they're completely beholden to that media apparatus that backs them. And the power behind that media apparatus, the U.S. deep state.
It's this incrementalism. It's really, it is very subtle because you don't notice it from day to day. But given this war's been going on, at least since the Russians.
You don't notice it because media doesn't report on it. Yeah, the mainstream at least. You have to watch YouTube channels like mine to get it, or streams like mine.
They did more than 4 years now. The rhetoric and openness, it is quite evident what has happened. For example, in this country, in Norway, when the Russians invaded, we had a prime minister who made it very clear that under no circumstance would we send weapons to a country at war. Now, of course, 4 years later, it's not a single member of parliament who opposes sending weapon, not a single member.
That's the power of propaganda of the U.S. global media apparatus.
Member of parliament suggests that we should even talk to the Russians. While today I looked in the paper and I see a headline that Norwegian drones will kill the Russians. This is it. So there's no more pretense. The hatred is already out there. The intention is there, and it's it would have been unthinkable to have this kind of language and positions only 4 years ago. But it's this incrementalism. It builds up. All dissent is being wiped away, and it's kind of frightening when you see this shift and how the public just walks along and follows this. But I wanted to ask
it's the lies after lies after lies, painting Russians as evil in Ukraine and Ukraine as good guys. Despite the Ukrainian leadership being literal Nazis that want inferior races dead, pretty much what they do. They think of Russians as inferior, and you have goons that go around and drag ethnic Russians outside in the winter, tape them to light poles, and just leave them to freeze. That's the execution method in Ukraine for that these Azov brigade bastards like to use.
But this concept you just brought up, the elite capture, because if you live in Europe, you tend to get the impression that a lot of this political leadership, they were trained, if you will, very closely with the United States.
And yes, universities, the other pillar of the deep state, with the top of the media, it has to do with media. The ties between CIA, the deep state, and universities is deep. And if you shape people's views through universities, you can convince them they're a gay, transgender, or to believe any other things like Russia's evil and Keynesian economics, which is nonsense. All types of madness if you control the universities.
Sometimes their loyalties are also not very clear. I mean, this is not shouldn't be controversial to say that Europe has a very denationalized political leadership, very much influenced by the United States. But how do you see the Europeans? What kind of instruments are there for this elite capture?
I think the European Union itself played a central role in all of this. The European Union was essentially a layer of bureaucracy the U.S. draped over continental Europe. And
exactly, a layer of bureaucracy draped over Europe so that the U.S. can more effectively control Europe.
Smothered individual national sovereignty. And we can see how Europe systematically...
And why they like mass migration is it erodes national identities across Europe. And makes Brussels stronger. So, of course, Brussels likes mass migration.
Searches for, hunts down, and eradicates any sense of national interests within the entire European Union. And I can't remember what the referendum was for, but it was maybe Ireland being part of...
The thing is, it will fail, the push to erase national identity, because if nothing else, language. They can't erase the language. France speak French, Germans speak German. And that having a language of your own, it gives you a national identity in a way that nothing else does. And they're not going to be able to create a United States of Europe in the same way as there's the United States of America. United States of America, we had one state that spoke a little bit of French, Louisiana, but everyone else was English. It was much easier to create one unified country out of the United States. Europe, it's no country in Europe is giving up their language.
The European Union or something like that. And there's many, many examples of this. I'm sure you could provide several as well being in Europe, where they have the referendum, it doesn't go the way they want it. So they just hit the information space for a year or two, and then they do it again and again and again and again until
Exactly. I've
information
watched that happen, and it's so frustrating.
space has been sufficiently manipulated and they get the results that they want. Except that's not actual self-determination. That's using the illusion of democracy and self-determination to manipulate and control people and to channel them in a direction that is actually objectively contrary to their own best interests. And having all of these European countries collectively placed under the European Union and subjected to a collective foreign policy that is detrimental to all of Europe's.
Luckily, as the U.S. empire collapses, the EU will be broken up too. It's finished. There'll be such anger because the day the dollar goes down, it'll happen. During that same period is where all the lies told over decades will be exposed. The two will happen at the same time, as everyone loses complete faith in mainstream media because the currency is collapsing. Alternative media people like myself and people more famous and more influential will explain how the world really works. And oh boy, will people be angry. And the Asmongold's of the world will call for blood. Then there'll be lynching.
Best interest and each individual member state's best interest. How is that objectively against the best interests of big business in Europe, the ordinary people across Europe, all kinds of groups of people, big and small, all across the continent. And you can see how it has harmed Europe over, and we could just talk about the last, since 2014, actually. And before 2014, I actually thought there was a good chance that Europe would work its way out from under U.S. Subordination, because they were building the Nord Stream pipelines. They were working closely with Russia.
No, the United States, as long as the number one pillar of U.S. strength is not its military, it's its propaganda arm through its worldwide propaganda network. It pushes what the deep state wants. And with that still in place, there's no chance of Europe breaking free.
And with China, and I thought for sure that they were going to make it. But then again, the U.S. provoked war. And under war, you have so many options to manipulate people emotionally, politically, economically, in terms of military power. And that's exactly what they did. They used the conflict they created with Russia in Ukraine to upset that process that was taking place, to cut Europe off from Russia, and also to begin the same process of cutting off Europe from cooperation with China. And so all of their alternatives were removed. The U.S. literally just blew up Nord Stream. And then through the persistence of this war with Russia, they've forced Europe to cut all energy incrementally off from Russia. And so this is what has fully and completely subordinated Europe to the United States. And so primarily the European Union, there's a lot of institutions and programs the U.S. runs in Europe, very similar to the National Endowment for Democracy, by parallel or adjacent organizations and institutions, both American government programs and private corporate foundations. And they've just chipped away at it. Like you say, it happened so slowly, people really didn't notice it until it was too late. And they've already accumulated this huge amount of power over Europe. And there's really nothing Europeans can do now to organize against it, unfortunately.
Well, the EU has a...
That's true for now, or maybe, but that will change. AfD is at 28% in Germany. I understand the pessimism. Like a decade ago, I was pessimistic too, watching everything go the way the deep state wants. Then Trump gets elected. Something absolutely outside what the deep state wanted. They're losing control in more and more places, in more and more ways. Things that elections are not going their way, wars are not going their way. The credibility of mainstream media keeps going lower and lower and lower. And thereby their ability to influence and shape the world. And so it's the dying empire, and it's an empire that needs to die, and the dollar will collapse, will signify its end.
A very interesting history. It has a tendency of looking at opposition as a temporary speed bump to be overcome. That is, well, for example, the EU constitution they wanted to have back in 2005. two of the few countries who had a referendum on it, France and Netherlands, said no. So then they sat down and think, okay, how can we overcome this opposition? Okay, let's reframe it as a treaty instead. So they made it into the Lisbon Treaty. Essentially rewrote it and just packed it in as a treaty, so there wouldn't have to be a referendum. But then, of course, the Irish still needed a referendum, and they also voted no. And then you had a campaign to re-educate them, enough pressure, and they made them vote again the following year, and then they got it right. And yeah, this is how it advances. And they have all this way of reassuring that
Yes, because you just need to pressure them, like flood the airwaves with right opinion right before these referendums, and do it intensely, and don't let people time to really think about it and for opposition to form. And then you can just pass these referendums one after another in these different places and trick the people to vote against their own interests.
As the EU takes on this power, they're still going to have a unanimous decision making, this kind of things. But now you see von der Leyen say, well, we can't have this makes us a hostage to unable to make decision. We have to be able to defend ourselves. So now, of course, they're going to centralize more and more power, something that's causing quite a lot of tension.
And soon taxation, they'll try to do taxation. I don't think that'll work. I think the system will break before they actually manage to implement taxation, like Brussels taxing all EU citizens. I think it won't fly, I think, but we'll see.
So it is it's becoming a very, well, I would put it as an ugly project, but I'll probably get in trouble for it.
You mean you already have 70% taxes in Germany, as we saw in the video yesterday? What's there left for the EU to tax?
Calling the EU an ugly project now, but this is what it's become. However, whenever you look at how the United States is trying to put Russia on hold, that is handed over to the Europeans, it's obviously because, well, they couldn't defeat Russia, and the United States has other objectives.
No, it's because of Trump. It's 100% because of Trump. He doesn't care about Ukraine, and that's he doesn't want to spend U.S. money on Ukraine. If it had been Kamala Harris, the United States would still be all on board with the Ukrainian venture. So that is one thing that sort of positive that Trump's doing internationally, is that it's no longer U.S. money going to Ukraine. But he was still sending U.S. weapons right up into this Iran war. He was not putting an end to it, putting any pressure. We're still sharing intelligence. Our generals are still directing the Ukrainian forces via Germany from their headquarters in Germany. So, but the one positive thing is that he was no longer willing to fund Ukraine, and that pushes it all on to the European, which are buckling under the strain of trying to prop up the war against Russia all on their own.
Adversary of the United States, the main peer rival will be China then. How do you see China fitting into this wider sequencing logic? Because they seem to be deprioritized at this moment. The US is still in Europe, is still fighting Iran. We're not seeing that much pressure against China at the moment.
I would argue that the U.S. war of aggression against Iran is actually a direct move against not just China, but even U.S. allies. I would call them proxies in Asia. And if you look at the energy exports from the entire region, not just from Iran to China, because Iran was basically exporting almost all of their energy to China, that has been reduced mainly through the U.S. blockade. The U.S. is lying. They're not controlling all shipping in and out of Iran, but they are turning back some of those ships, and a lot of those ships are bringing hydrocarbons to China. But the problem is the whole conflict, and everyone knew this was going to happen if the U.S. attacked Iran.
Not everyone. Trump thought it would be over in 3 days. And I'm sure there is big sections of the deep state apparatus, some places like in Israel, who honestly believe their own propaganda about Iran being on the verge of collapse. This putting Iran in such a strong position as it is today, that was not the deep state's desired outcome of this Iran war. I guarantee you. If you stretch it, you could try to reframe it like this guy, but that's not the truth. Having Japan dependent on oil from the Gulf, from U.S. proxies there, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and everything, that is good for the United States. They're relying on our proxies that we control. That's as good as them relying on oil directly from the United States.
Iran. They knew they would close the Strait of Hormuz. They knew Iran would retaliate. Whatever you hit inside Iran, they were going to hit in any country hosting U.S. troops, which is practically every country in the region. And that's what happened. And it reduced gas production, and then therefore exports, and also oil exports. And it got so bad that there are countries now here in Asia, countries like Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, that are buying more gas now from the United States than they are from the Middle East. And this is unprecedented because they got virtually all of their energy from the Middle East. Some of these countries, 90%.
Yes, it's good for oil producers in the U.S., but there was no big plan to do that. It's just the outcome that happened.
Or more of their energy came from the Middle East. Now they're buying it from the United States. And just like the US did to Europe vis-a-vis Russia.
Europe, that was planned. The cutoff of gas from Russia, that was deep state planned. Done. Yes, US producers getting ready to replace Russian producers. Yes, that I buy completely. But the closure of Strait of Hormuz, that was not a plan. The current disruption in basically bring the world economy to its knees right now. It's deep state did not want that.
They had all of these LNG export projects that they were building that people said, why are you building this? There's no way you're going to compete with steady, reliable, cheap gas from the Middle East. Except the US always knew that we're getting these ready for a reason, just like we were getting LNG export projects ready for Europe for a reason before it was economically viable. We were getting them online and ready because we always knew we were going to start a war with Russia in Ukraine, and we were going to force Europe off of energy from Russia, and we would have the solution already there in the process of coming online. And they are doing the exact same thing. So I stumbled across this Alaska LNG project run by Glenfarne, and that's exactly what it is. They've been working on it for years, and it makes no economic sense. And if you look at presentations from like last year, 2025, that they were sitting there basically pleading with the audience, yes, this makes economic sense. They mentioned contested waterways many, many times because they said if Asia is getting energy from us in Alaska, it's like a virtual pipeline. There's no way anyone can.
Okay, perhaps there were some. I'd have to look into this more.
And there's so many other contested waterways that aren't very safe out there. But they didn't say that, well, it will be the US and its war of aggression against Iran next year that ends up closing those waterways and making this otherwise unviable project suddenly viable. So it was a definite premeditated conspiracy. They are doing exactly to Asia what they have done to Europe. And of course, how does this affect China? First of all, they're deliberately cutting China off from energy from the Middle East. It was like half of their imports of energy were coming from the Middle East. But then now they're forcing countries in Asia, not just US proxies like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, but even countries like Vietnam to place themselves under energy dependence on the US. And that gives the US extraordinary control and leverage over these countries strategically, politically, to basically
whatever these projects that are coming online in the United States, it's nowhere near enough to replace what's being lost. So I'll have to look into it.
Form them into what the US has already transformed Europe vis-a-vis Russia. They can transform these countries in Asia into battering rams, all aimed at China. So it will accelerate that process that was already underway. And what they're doing is essentially surrounding China with hostile nations that are dependent on the US for energy, really have no other option. You know, people could blame Vietnam for buying energy from the US, but what was their alternative? It's mainly
the thing is, if this is true, then things will escalate in the Middle East because closure of Strait of Hormuz for a couple of months, then it opens again. These projects in the United States are still, again, become not viable in a couple of months when everything goes back online in the Middle East. So you have to have escalation, all the oil infrastructure in the Middle East gone for this dependence that he's talking about to be long-term. Oh boy, if that's really the plan, and will Trump go along with it?
At this point, not buy it and then just leave tens of millions of people without cooking gas. It really wasn't an option. So the US got a lot of countries in Asia exactly where the US wanted them, and they had the solution already in the works and ready to take advantage of it. There's literally a National Council of Energy Dominance created by the US government for this specific purpose, and it has transcended. It's not President Trump doing this. This began all the way under the Obama administration, and it has been incrementally advanced every single administration since then. And so eventually the US will have Russia and China in a situation where they're surrounded by hostile US proxies, and the US will be chipping away at Russia and China themselves. Just like the US is just outright attacking Russia with these drones, they will begin a process of doing something similar with China, almost certainly. I mean, this is what they're openly preparing to do.
That's might be what they're preparing. It's not going to work.
No, it's sometimes you wonder why the different leaders don't appreciate what's happening, because on one hand, the Trump is talking about how he wants the Ukraine war to come to an end because he's so appalled by all the killing, and
a lot of those Asian nations are also turning to guess who? Russia for oil. You have Japan going to Russia and trying to work out a deal. So if you're making them dependent not only on the United States but also Russia, it doesn't work. It doesn't. If they get Russia's oil still there.
Even though the US is still up to its eyeballs in terms of how it's involved. But at the same time, I saw the US, only yesterday was the US Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright. He was in Croatia, is promoting Trump's peace pipeline, Trump's peace pipeline framework, in which he advocated how all these countries who have always been dependent on Russia for energy, well, that's a horrible position to be in. So they would all be liberated now, and they would have now American energy. And again, it's very in your face, but at the same time, it also begs the question, well, the only reason why they would go for more expensive and I would say less reliable American energy would be because the war is going on. So, to what extent can they afford to actually let the war die out? I mean, towards the end of the
And Trump, I still believe he's going to put export restrictions on the price of oil as midterms approaches and natural gas. So it's, yeah, definitely not a reliable source, the United States.
Cold War, Gorbachev, he made a point to the Americans that is, if we put an end to the Cold War, we also have to recognize and manage what this means for the power structures, because the whole alliance systems, which put Washington and Moscow in a, I guess, a very powerful position, have become dependent on war. So if we end the Cold War, we also have to keep our hawks in mind that we have to walk away from some of this. But it doesn't look like the US is prepared in any ways to walk away from this war. It's just shocking that the European leaders don't seem to mind that they're just going to be deindustrialized and be put in a situation of perpetual conflict with the world's largest nuclear power. It's it's hard to see why, but what do you see being the possibility though of keeping this Iranian thing going on long enough? Because in Europe, you can hand over the war to the Europeans, fine. They seem more than willing to throw away their economies and send their sons and daughters to die. But in the Middle East, you can't hand over the war to the Gulf states. First of all, they don't have the capability, but also they're not willing to fight either.
They can't. They have huge Shia Muslim populations that they need their militaries at home to keep their government safe from being overthrown. They can't afford to send them off into Iran to fight. And these are dictatorships. They have no huge loyal populations to tap for armies. The Gulf states have no ability to wage a ground war against Iran.
How long can the United States keep itself in this position? Because it's bleeding out as well in terms of ammunition.
Well, at the level that they were expending munitions from the beginning of this most recent phase, because again, the U.S. has been on and off at war with Iran since the end of the Biden administration. Actually, people remember Israel has, on behalf of the U.S., attacked Iran in late 2024. At that level of munition expenditure, there's no way they could continue sustaining it. But of course, there's a ceasefire right now. Except ceasefire or no ceasefire, the amount of energy coming out of the region and going to Asia has been strangled and it has been reduced significantly. I would surmise that if energy does start flowing through, whether it's from Iran or from some other states in the region, the U.S. will just start it again for a week or 2 weeks.
No, Europe is being collapsed. It's an attempt to take down Russia. Ukraine was an attempt to take down Russia. It's failing. Ukraine is losing. And now they're leveraging all of Europe. They're like doubling down on their bet to try to take out Russia because they need to keep the dollar system going. Taking out Russia, making it collapse and balkanizing it could get them as much as another decade if they looted all of Russia, or at least 5 years. And so they're just desperately gambling on that. And they're willing to throw all of Europe sacrifice all of Europe in an attempt to take down Russia. But I think they'll fail because Europe, they don't have the ability to take on Russia. Europe without the United States cannot fight Russia.
Strike at maybe Karg Islands, have Iran retaliate against energy production in the Persian Gulf Arab states, and reduce all of that capacity again, and thus reduce exports out of the region. So again, the U.S. has been building these otherwise completely irrational LNG export projects to Asia. The only way they make economic sense is if this war with Iran continues. And it doesn't have to continue at the pace the U.S. was pursuing it in the beginning. They just got it going. They did this initial damage. Some people are saying it might take a year or more for some of the damage to be repaired in terms of energy production and exports in some of the Persian Gulf states. So all they have to do is maintain that and just keep the flow of energy under threat and reduced while they make this transition. We remember that the transition from Russian energy to American energy in terms of Europe, that's still actually taking place. They still haven't completely cut themselves off from Russian energy. So it's a process that's going to stretch over a couple of years.
Yeah, but Russian energy will be redirected towards Asia. It's not just those Asian countries aren't just buying from the U.S. They're also buying from Russia. And that contradicts your narrative. I think that it's just more understandable way to look at it is that, yes, some places in deep state knew this Iran war was coming. They definitely, I know commentators that were talking about this war with Iran was coming for over a year. And anyone who knew that was coming decided to do this LNG in anticipation for it. A grand plan in terms of energy. At least Trump's not involved. He thought this was going to be over in 3 days. And if the plan was to take out Middle East oil production, then there's going to have to be another round of escalation and oil infrastructure in the Gulf destroyed. And I don't see. No, I don't think that deep state wants that, just because the financial crisis it would create in the United States would endanger the dollar. It would endanger the financial system. It would create another 2008 financial crisis, taking out all the oil infrastructure in the Gulf. And if you don't take out that oil infrastructure, then eventually pressure will grow in the rest of the world enough so that Trump is forced to capitulate and the Strait of Hormuz gets opened. If the infrastructure isn't actually destroyed, like somewhere between 3 and 6 months, the pressure from the rest of the world will grow so great that this crisis will end and the Strait of Hormuz will open. At that point, the oil will be free. So he brought up an interesting point about how the United States was developing projects that made no sense without the Iran war. But the answer to that is some oil executives knew this Iran war was coming and did this investment with that in mind. And Qatar LNG production was damaged, same as Iranian. So even if those LNG projects in the United States with that damage, they might be viable already. Anyway, I think that's enough of this for now. This will be on YouTube. Like and subscribe. Come watch on Kick or Twitch. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye.